The air in the kitchen went deathly silent as Paul Bates grabbed Dawn McNally by her hair, yanking her head back in front of his friends. Her breath hitched for only a second, just long enough to steady herself. In an instant, with lightning speed, she wrenched his grip from her scalp, swept his legs, and slammed him onto the pristine marble floor. His smug arrogance vanished in the blink of an eye as he gasped for air, his face twisted in shock and humiliation. The same boy who'd mocked her moments before was now crying, begging for release. What had just happened? How had a simple maid's daughter reduced Paul Bates, heir to a multi-million-dollar empire, to nothing more than a whimpering, helpless wreck? The answers lay somewhere in the shadows of their world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's continue. The kitchen of the Bates mansion was a monument to wealth and privilege. The floors were polished marble, gleaming under the soft light streaming through the massive windows, and the countertops were lined with gleaming stainless steel appliances, each one more expensive than most families' monthly rent. On October 18, 2022, the mansion hummed with the quiet elegance of a home where money was never an issue, and luxury was the expectation, not the exception. Paul Bates, 18 years old, heir to the Bates fortune, sat casually on a bar stool by the kitchen island, wearing a hoodie and band t-shirt. His outfit might have looked like something worn by any other teenager, but it felt hollow here. A strange contrast to the surroundings, to his privilege. His posture was relaxed, almost bored, but his eyes gleamed with the kind of arrogance only someone born into unimaginable wealth could possess. His friends, a group of similarly rich and untouchable high school seniors, surrounded him, lounging in the sprawling kitchen as if they owned the space, and in a sense, they did. Their laughter echoed through the room, carefree and loud, the kind that filled the air with a weight of superiority. Among them, Dawn McNally, the 16-year-old daughter of the family's maid, stood at the counter, her movements fluid and precise as she prepared refreshments. She wasn't part of the privileged world that surrounded her, but she belonged here, if only in the shadows. Her dark skin contrasted against the pristine kitchen. Her modest uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron, an invisible boundary between her and them. Dawn's presence was like a calm ripple in the chaos of their self-indulgent laughter, her poise quiet but undeniably powerful. Her mother, Megan McNally, worked quietly beside her, wiping down the counters, as always, invisible to the guests. But it was Dawn who had learned to exist in the liminal space between worlds, never fully acknowledged, never fully ignored. She'd grown used to this role over the years, moving through life with an air of quiet resilience. The world around her may have seemed perfect, but Dawn knew better. Beneath the shiny surface of the Bates mansion, the darkness lurked just out of sight. But today would be different. Today, it would all change. The laughter of the boys drifted over to Dawn as they made crude jokes, their voices rising as they took pleasure in their own superiority. One of them, a tall boy named Drew, elbowed Paul, laughing loudly. "I still can't believe how lucky you are, man. You get the whole damn mansion, and the maid's daughter does all the grunt work. I'd be living like a king if I had it all." "Yeah, well, not all of us are born with silver spoons in our mouths," Paul replied, his tone dripping with mockery. He glanced toward Dawn, and the smirk on his face grew, a slow, deliberate curve that told Dawn this wouldn't be a casual joke. This was a game, one in which she was the unwitting pawn. "Hey, Dawn," Paul said, his voice cutting through the idle chatter. "Don't you think it's a little beneath you? Cleaning up after us?" His words were laced with contempt, a pointed attack meant to humiliate. He leaned back, looking at her with that same lazy smirk, as though waiting for her to cower in shame. The group of friends erupted into laughter, their amusement at her expense sharp and pointed. They saw Dawn's quiet demeanor as an invitation to mock her, a validation of their own power and privilege. After all, she was nothing but the help. The laughter, loud and jarring, echoed off the kitchen walls like a declaration of dominance. But Dawn didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she set the tray down on the counter with a slow, deliberate motion, as if time itself had paused for just a moment. She lifted her chin, her eyes locking with Paul's, her gaze steady and calm, far more composed than anyone expected. "Funny," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "I was just wondering how it feels to be born with privilege that isn't earned." Her words hung in the air, an almost imperceptible shift in the room. The laughter tapered off, and for a moment there was only silence. The tension was palpable. Even Paul's friends, once so eager to laugh, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their smirks faltering. The sound of Dawn's words had cut deeper than they realized, exposing something raw, something unsettling in Paul's arrogance. Paul's smile faltered, and for the briefest of moments his eyes betrayed a flicker of insecurity, a crack in the carefully crafted facade of wealth and privilege that he had built around himself. He quickly recovered, masking the vulnerability with his usual bravado. But the moment had passed, and the power dynamic had shifted, if only slightly. Dawn had spoken back, and her calm defiance had unsettled him in a way he didn't fully understand. But Paul wasn't one to let a challenge go unanswered, especially not in front of his friends. He had to reassert control, to prove that he was still the one in charge. He couldn't look weak in front of them. He couldn't let Dawn get away with showing him up, even if it was only for a fleeting moment. Without warning, Paul lunged across the kitchen island, his hand shooting out to grab Dawn by her hair, intending to yank her head back, to put her in her place. The room tensed, every pair of eyes in the kitchen fixed on the scene unfolding. Dawn's friends held their breath, some of them already reaching for their phones, eager to capture the moment. Paul's arrogance filled the air as he thought he could bring Dawn to heel with a simple act of violence. His mind raced, knowing that with this single gesture, he could return to the position of power. But what Paul didn't know was that he had just made his biggest mistake. The air in the kitchen thickened as Paul's fingers closed around Dawn's hair, yanking her head back with force. The room was frozen in anticipation, waiting for Dawn to cower, waiting for her to break. But Dawn didn't react the way they expected. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Instead, Dawn's muscles tensed, her body moving with a fluid precision that no one had anticipated. In a single, smooth motion, Dawn shifted her weight, using Paul's grip against him. Her hand moved faster than anyone could follow, disarming his hold with ease. With a quick twist of her body, she swept his legs from under him, sending him crashing to the floor with a loud thud that reverberated through the kitchen. The room was silent, save for the sound of Paul's breathless gasp as he tried to push himself up. His friends stared, wide-eyed, their phones forgotten in their hands. Paul, the heir to an empire, the golden boy, was now the one on the floor, completely vulnerable. He tried to move, to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. Dawn stood above him, poised and calm, as though the entire situation was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her day. Paul's chest heaved, his arrogance shattered. He reached for her, desperation flashing across his face. You can't do this. You think you're better than me?" His voice cracked, the tough facade he had worn for years, crumbling under the weight of his humiliation. But Dawn simply shook her head, her expression cold and composed. "No," she said quietly. "I think you're just like every other bully with too much money and not enough character." With one last final move, she pushed Paul down again, her knee pressing into his chest, her body a quiet force of power and control. As Paul lay there, struggling to catch his breath, the reality of his situation set in. He wasn't in charge anymore. And as Dawn looked down at him, her gaze unwavering, she realized she had just become something she had always avoided. Visible. The world that had overlooked her, the world that had written her off as nothing but a maid's daughter, would never see her the same way again. The kitchen was silent except for the sound of Paul's labored breathing as he lay on the cold marble floor. His fingers twitched, trying to find purchase, to push himself up. But his body betrayed him. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment, his earlier arrogance now a distant memory. He was no longer the untouchable heir to a fortune. Now, he was nothing more than a boy who had made the mistake of underestimating someone far stronger than he had ever imagined. Dawn McNally stood above him, her stance unwavering, her eyes cold and composed. Her calm, measured breathing was the only sign of the storm of emotions swirling within her. She had been waiting for this moment, a moment when she would no longer be the invisible servant, when she would no longer be reduced to the background. The moment had come, and she was ready. Her training, which had begun when she was just 6 years old, took over instinctively. The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga techniques that had been ingrained in her over the years were now second nature. She had known how to defend herself for as long as she could remember. And yet, today, she had never needed them more. As Paul had reached out to grab her hair, his attempt to reassert his dominance was met with swift and calculated retaliation. His grip on her hair was gone before he even realized it, his momentum working against him as she swept his legs from under him. With practiced ease, she had placed him in a submission hold, locking him on the floor, his face twisted in pain and shock. His friends stood frozen, their laughter now replaced with stunned silence. Some had fumbled for their phones, hoping to capture the spectacle. But no one had expected this. The man who ruled the high school social hierarchy, the one who had always been the center of attention, was now on the floor, helpless and crying out. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with disbelief and the undeniable truth that the tables had turned. "Let go of me," Paul cried out, his voice strained as he struggled against Dawn's hold. His words were desperate, pleading, but Dawn did not release him. She could feel the weight of the moment, the power she had over him, but she didn't gloat. Her expression remained calm, her focus unwavering. This wasn't about humiliating Paul, not entirely. It was about showing him, showing everyone, that his wealth, his privilege, his entitlement meant nothing in the face of true strength. "Please, just let me go," Paul begged, his voice cracking with frustration and panic. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, were now wide with fear, his vulnerability raw and exposed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Let me up." Dawn's gaze remained steady, unflinching. She had heard these kinds of pleas before, from people who thought they could control others with their power. But she wasn't like the others. She wasn't some helpless girl to be manipulated. She had spent years learning how to fight back, how to stand her ground. And in this moment, she wasn't just fighting Paul Bates. She was fighting every injustice she had ever faced. Every time she had been overlooked, every time she had been dismissed as the help. As Paul continued to struggle, Megan McNally, standing quietly at the doorway, watched the scene unfold. Her face was a mask of mixed emotions. Pride, fear, and something else. Something deeper that only a mother could understand. She had always known that Dawn was different, that there was something inside her that could not be broken. But seeing it unfold in real time, seeing her daughter take control of the situation, left Megan with a sense of awe and fear. Megan had raised Dawn with everything she had. They had been through a lot together, living in the shadows of the wealthy, surviving on the edges of a world that never cared about them. Megan had always taught Dawn how to stay strong, how to endure. But she had never imagined that one day her daughter would stand up to someone like Paul Bates, someone who had lived his entire life with the belief that he was untouchable. And yet, here they were. "Please, I can't breathe," Paul gasped, his voice desperate. His arrogance was gone now, replaced with the kind of vulnerability he had never experienced before. The rich boy, the privileged son, was now the one begging. Dawn could see the tears welling up in his eyes, the fear that had crept in, and for a moment, she felt something like sympathy. But it didn't last. Dawn's grip remained firm, her calmness contrasting sharply with Paul's frantic struggles. "You should have thought about that before you decided to treat me like a joke," she said, her voice steady, almost detached. "Maybe you'll think twice next time before you try to humiliate someone." The power shift in the room was complete. Paul Bates, the arrogant millionaire's son, was now completely at Dawn's mercy. His friends, who had once seen him as the untouchable leader of their group, stood in stunned silence, unsure of how to react. They had all expected Dawn to be weak, to back down, to crumble under pressure. Instead, she had shown them something entirely different: strength. Real strength. Some of Paul's friends whispered amongst themselves, their words low and hesitant. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. They had all seen Paul as untouchable, as someone who could do whatever he wanted without consequence. But now they were seeing him as a human being, flawed, vulnerable, and completely powerless. "What is this?" one of Paul's friends muttered, glancing nervously around the room. "Is this for real?" I can't believe this is happening," another friend said, his voice shaky. He's crying?" The realization was sinking in for them too. Paul Bates, the golden boy, was on the floor, completely undone. And it was Dawn who had brought him there. But as the group stood in shock, whispers beginning to spread, Megan's knowing glance lingered on Paul's friends, her eyes narrowing. She could see the gears turning in their heads, could hear the murmurs of disbelief and unease. And she knew, deep down, that this moment would not just be a turning point for Paul. It would be the beginning of something much bigger, something she had long suspected but never dared to confront. The Bates family, with their wealth and influence, had always lived in a bubble, immune to consequences. But that bubble had just been burst, and Megan was more aware than anyone that this moment, this unveiling strike, was just the first step. Her eyes flicked to the corner of the room, where the quiet hum of an expensive, hidden phone could be heard, the subtle glow of a screen lighting up the otherwise dark corner. One of Paul's friends had taken the opportunity to capture the entire scene on camera. The camera was still rolling, and Megan knew that soon, everything would change. The truth, all of it, would start coming to light. What Paul and his friends didn't know was that this small moment of humiliation was just the beginning. Dawn's eyes shifted briefly to her mother, seeing the knowing look in her face. Megan's expression was a mix of pride, fear, and a deep understanding of the consequences. Dawn's heart raced, but she didn't look away from Paul. She held him there, her grip unyielding, watching the tears fall from his eyes. As Paul's cries echoed through the kitchen, his friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, their once confident demeanor now cracked and uncertain. Their whispers grew louder, and Dawn could feel the shift in the room, the quiet murmurings of secrets about to be unearthed. But just as quickly as it began, the tension in the room shifted once more. Megan, her face pale and unreadable, turned toward the door. She knew that the Bates family's secrets were not limited to Paul's arrogance or the way he had treated Dawn. There was more. So much more. And it was only a matter of time before everything would be exposed. As Dawn finally let go of Paul's arm, watching him scramble to his feet, she knew one thing for sure. The power had shifted. And now, the truth would come to light, no matter how hard they tried to bury it. The tension in the kitchen lingered long after Paul Bates had retreated to the solitude of his bedroom, his pride shattered and his face still red from the humiliation. Dawn McNally stood silently by the counter, wiping her hands on the dish rag as she tried to steady her breathing. The room felt different now, heavier, charged with the weight of the moment that had just unfolded. Megan McNally, Dawn's mother, had stepped back from the scene, her face unreadable, her thoughts running deep. She had always known Dawn was special, had known that her daughter was capable of much more than the world ever gave her credit for. But even Megan hadn't anticipated the scale of what had just happened, the sudden shift in the power dynamics between Dawn and the Bates family. As the staff continued with their work, the kitchen buzzed with hushed whispers. Eyes darted from the corners of the room, unsure whether to address the elephant in the room. The incident, though brief, was already becoming the subject of gossip. The rich, privileged world of the Bates family had always seemed impenetrable, a world where status and wealth protected its inhabitants from the consequences of their actions. But today, something had changed. The laughter of Paul's friends still echoed in Megan's ears, and she knew that they were all still processing what had just happened. No one had ever seen Paul Bates, the heir to the Bates fortune, brought to his knees in front of his friends, humiliated by the quiet maid's daughter. Dawn's calm response, her grace under pressure, had been a shock to everyone. To the staff, it had been a quiet revolution, a reminder that power wasn't just a product of money or social status, but of the strength one could cultivate in silence. Megan glanced at Dawn, who had returned to her duties without a word, her expression composed but distant. She knew her daughter well enough to see the weight of the moment on her face. Dawn had always carried herself with dignity, even in the face of humiliation. But there was something different about the way she held herself now. A quiet confidence, perhaps, or the beginning of something more. As Dawn moved through the kitchen, setting plates and cleaning up, Megan's mind wandered back to the years of struggle, the quiet lessons that had shaped her daughter into the woman she had become. Megan had never wanted Dawn to live in the shadows of the wealthy, but their circumstances had made it impossible to escape that world. Megan's life had always been tied to the Bates family, serving as a reminder that no matter how hard she worked, she and her daughter would always be beneath them. But that had never stopped Megan from giving Dawn everything she could, every ounce of her energy, every lesson she had learned, every bit of wisdom that would help Dawn rise above the limits that had been set for her. When Dawn had shown an interest in martial arts at a young age, Megan had been hesitant, unsure whether it was a fight against the world or an outlet for her daughter's frustrations. But she had seen the determination in Dawn's eyes, the quiet resolve that no one could understand, and so she had supported it, even when it meant finding a local mentor who was willing to take Dawn under his wing. It had been an unlikely partnership, an older man with a history in the martial arts world, one who had seen potential in Dawn from the very first moment he laid eyes on her. Under his guidance, Dawn had learned not just the art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga, but also the art of self-control, discipline, and resilience. It was through these lessons that Dawn had learned to protect her dignity, to stand tall when others tried to tear her down. She had learned that power wasn't about physical strength alone. It was about knowing when to fight and when to remain calm, when to strike and when to hold back. Megan's eyes softened as she watched Dawn. She was proud of her daughter, proud of the strength she had found within herself, but she also feared for her. The world they lived in was a harsh one, where the wealthy and powerful controlled everything, and Dawn had just exposed a vulnerability in that world. Megan knew it was only a matter of time before the Bates family tried to push back. Sure enough, moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and the door to the kitchen creaked open. Megan turned, her heart sinking as she saw Richard Bates, Paul's father, standing in the doorway. His presence was commanding, his sharp features set in a look of quiet authority. "Megan," Richard said, his voice cold but measured. "I need to speak with you." Dawn didn't look up as Richard's gaze shifted toward her, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. There was no warmth in his expression, just the familiar coldness that had come to define the Bates family. The tension in the air thickened, but Megan remained calm. She had been through this before. The Bates family didn't take kindly to any perceived disrespect, and Paul's humiliation would not go unnoticed. "Of course, Mr. Bates," Megan said, her voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Richard motioned for her to follow him, and Megan moved toward the door, her eyes briefly meeting Dawn's. There was a flicker of something in Dawn's gaze, a question maybe, or a silent understanding. But Megan said nothing as she followed Richard into the hallway. They walked a few steps down the long corridor to a quiet office, where Richard closed the door behind them. Megan's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral as Richard took a seat behind his desk. "I've been hearing rumors about what happened in the kitchen," Richard began, his voice still controlled, but the underlying threat in his words was clear. "I'm concerned about the implications of this incident. My son is an important part of this family's legacy, and I will not tolerate anyone undermining his authority. Megan kept her eyes fixed on him, her body tense but composed. She had learned long ago that the Bates family's power was built on intimidation. But she wasn't afraid, not anymore. She knew the truth, and she wasn't about to let them dictate her daughter's worth. "I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding," Megan said quietly, her voice calm. "Dawn didn't intend to cause any trouble. She's just doing her job." Richard's eyes flashed with irritation. "Your daughter is a maid. She should know her place. The fact that she embarrassed my son in front of his friends is something I can't overlook." Megan's chest tightened, but she remained silent. She wasn't about to engage in this power struggle. She had seen enough of this world to know that they would never see Dawn for what she truly was. To them, she was just a maid's daughter. But Megan knew better. Dawn was more than that. As Richard continued to lecture her, Megan's thoughts drifted back to the kitchen, where Dawn was likely still processing everything that had just happened. Megan could only imagine the weight of the moment on her daughter's shoulders, the quiet victory she had achieved. But Megan also knew that this was just the beginning. The Bates family wouldn't let this humiliation slide. They would come after Dawn, after her, and Megan would have to be ready. Just as the conversation reached its boiling point, Megan's phone buzzed in her pocket. She excused herself, stepping out into the hallway to answer. The message was cryptic, but it made her blood run cold. "The Bates' fortune isn't as clean as it seems. We have evidence." Megan's heart skipped a beat as she read the message. She knew this was the moment when everything she had feared would finally come to light. She couldn't keep her daughter in the shadows forever. But this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about something bigger. And Dawn had unknowingly stepped into a battle that had been brewing for years. As Megan returned to the office, she knew the Bates family's secrets were no longer safe. And neither were they. Dawn had sparked something, and now the echoes of humiliation would reverberate far beyond the walls of the Bates mansion. In the distance, Megan overheard a conversation as she walked back toward the kitchen. A whispering voice, barely audible but unmistakable. "This isn't just about one fight. The Bates family is involved in something much darker." Megan's heart tightened. The walls were closing in, and she could feel the weight of it all pressing down. She had to protect her daughter, no matter the cost. Dawn stood still in the grand hallway outside the kitchen, her heartbeat still quick from the confrontation that had just unfolded. The echoes of Paul's humiliation rang in her ears as she took a steadying breath. For a brief moment, it had felt like the world shifted, as though the rules that governed their lives had been upended. She had exposed Paul, the golden child of the Bates family, as weak and vulnerable in front of his friends, something that had never happened before. His sense of invulnerability had shattered, and with it, the illusion of his superiority. But Dawn wasn't content to let this moment pass without securing her position. Her mind raced with the possibilities now open to her. There was power in what had just happened, and she knew how to use it. She wasn't some helpless servant anymore. She wasn't just the maid's daughter. She was someone who had just forced the mighty to bend, at least for the moment. Dawn's resolve hardened. She had to confront Paul privately. She had to press her advantage while she still could. As she approached Paul's room, her footsteps were measured, purposeful. She knocked once, and when no answer came, she entered anyway. Paul sat on the edge of his bed, his posture hunched as he stared at the floor, his hands clutching his phone with white knuckles. He was still processing what had happened, still in shock. His pride had been shredded in front of his friends, and now he was alone, his emotional fortress crumbling. He didn't look up as Dawn entered, but she could feel the rage simmering beneath his silence. She wasn't interested in mercy. This was the moment to make him see that she wasn't someone to be trampled on. She wasn't just the help. She wasn't someone to be looked down on. "I didn't think you had it in you," Paul muttered without meeting her eyes, his voice rough. "Guess you've been waiting for the right time, huh? Just playing the part of the innocent maid's daughter all along?" Dawn stood tall in the doorway, her gaze unwavering. She crossed her arms, feeling the weight of the power shift between them. "It wasn't about playing a part," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It was about waiting for you to make a mistake. And you just made a big one. Paul finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, his face flushed with anger. You think this changes anything? He spat. You think you've got the upper hand? You're just a maid's daughter, nothing more. The venom in his voice was palpable, but Dawn didn't flinch. If anything, it strengthened her resolve. I think I've shown you exactly how things work now. You might have money and status, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people like trash. It doesn't give you the right to humiliate people who don't have what you have. Paul's lips curled into a sneer, but there was no confidence behind it, only desperation. You think you're better than me now, huh? He hissed, his fists clenching at his sides. You think you've got something on me? You really don't understand what you've done. My father, he's got everything under control. He can make this all go away. You'll never be able to touch us. You'll never be anything but a maid's daughter, no matter what you do. Dawn's heart beat a little faster at the mention of his father. There it was. His shield. The Bates fortune, the power that had allowed Paul to rule his world with impunity. It was clear now, in the way Paul spoke, that he wasn't just relying on his own power. He was leaning heavily on his father's wealth to maintain control. It was a crutch, one he had never learned to walk without, and it made him vulnerable. Vulnerable enough for Dawn to exploit. I'm not trying to be better than you, Paul, Dawn replied, her tone steady. But I am demanding respect, and you're going to give it to me, or else I'll make sure your father's empire crumbles around you. Paul froze at her words, his mouth opening and closing in disbelief. His gaze flickered to the door, as if he was considering making a break for it. But something in his eyes told Dawn that he knew he was trapped. She had taken away his advantage, and now he was exposed. I'm not afraid of you, Paul finally muttered, his voice losing its edge. My dad's got connections. Your dad can't protect you from everything, Dawn interrupted. Not when the truth comes out. Before Paul could respond, the door to the room opened, and Megan entered, her face grim. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes meeting Dawn's for a brief moment, before they moved to Paul, who now looked more like a frightened child than the arrogant young man he had been just hours ago. Megan, Paul's voice was strained. This is all just a misunderstanding. You know how things get with me and Dawn. We were just having a little fun. Fun? Megan's voice was low and sharp, cutting him off mid-sentence. You think this is fun, Paul? You humiliate my daughter and you think it's fun? You think it's some game? Megan's gaze flickered to Dawn, and Dawn could see the worry in her mother's eyes. But it was tempered by something else. Something that had always been there. Something deep and steady, like a quiet river running through the storm. Megan knew what Dawn had done. And despite the shock, despite the consequences, there was something else in her eyes. Pride. Enough, Megan said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. I'm not going to sit back and let you two destroy each other. But Dawn, I need to show you something. Megan walked over to the bookshelf and pulled out a small leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. She handed it to Dawn, her hands steady but her expression filled with a quiet sadness. Dawn's heart sank as she opened the ledger. Inside were handwritten entries, neat and precise. The contents, however, sent a chill down her spine. The ledger detailed years of exploitation by the Bates family, unpaid wages, blackmail, and manipulation of the staff. Names and dates were recorded meticulously, revealing the systemic abuse that had been hidden for years. Dawn's eyes widened as she read through the pages, each line confirming her suspicions about the Bates family's true nature. This is everything, Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. I've been keeping it for years, watching the way they treated us, watching the way they used their power to control people like us. I never wanted to bring it to light, but now, I don't know what else to do. Dawn's fingers trembled as she held the ledger. It was a weapon, one that could shatter the Bates family's carefully constructed image. But even as she processed the magnitude of what they had, the weight of what had happened in the kitchen hung in the air. Dawn knew they had a limited amount of time. The Bates family would come after them soon, trying to silence everything they knew. Then, as if on cue, Paul's voice broke through the silence. You think this is going to change anything? He asked, his voice trembling with frustration and fear. You think you can bring down my family with some ledger? You have no idea what you're up against. My dad— Your dad's name will be in the paper soon enough, Dawn said coldly, her eyes fixed on him. And you'll be right there with him. This isn't over, Paul, not by a long shot. Paul's eyes flared with anger, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Before Dawn could say another word, Paul did something unexpected. He blurted out, I was just trying to protect the family business. You don't understand. My dad— He's the one who made the deal, not me. I just wanted to prove myself to him. The words spilled out of him in a rush, his voice desperate. And in that moment, Dawn saw the opening she needed. What deal, Paul? Megan asked, her voice cold but sharp. I can't— Paul started, but then stopped, his face pale. He glanced at the door, his hand nervously reaching for his phone. I didn't mean to— It's too late for that, Dawn interrupted. You've already said enough. Megan's eyes narrowed as Paul's face turned even whiter. He had just accidentally confessed to something far more dangerous than he realized. Dawn exchanged a knowing glance with her mother. This was the break they had been waiting for, the first crack in the Bates family's facade. Now, the game had truly begun. The air in the Bates mansion felt different now. The tension was thick, each breath carrying the weight of the decisions that had to be made. Dawn stood by the kitchen counter, the leather-bound ledger in her hands like a heavy secret, a weapon that could bring everything crashing down. Her fingers traced the edges of the pages, each entry a reminder of the betrayal that had been hidden for so long. But this wasn't just a ledger. It was the key to unraveling the dark, twisted world of the Bates family. And now, Dawn had to decide what to do with it. Megan stood beside her, her face pale but resolute. Dawn could see the strength in her mother's eyes, the years of silent suffering that had led to this moment. Megan had always kept the truth hidden, always carried the weight of the family's exploitation without speaking a word. But now that silence was broken, and there was no going back. The path forward was fraught with risk, but they both knew there was no other choice. We can't keep this to ourselves, Megan, Dawn said quietly, her voice steady, but filled with the gravity of their situation. We have to take it to the authorities. They need to see what they've been hiding. Megan looked at her daughter, the weight of the decision mirrored in her eyes. I've thought about it for years, Dawn, she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. But taking this step, it could destroy us. The Bates family doesn't lose, and if we go public with this, we'll never be able to go back to the way things were. The risk— I know, Dawn interrupted, her voice unwavering. But they can't keep getting away with it. Not anymore. I'm not going to stand by and let them ruin lives without consequence. The conflict raged inside Dawn. She had always known that her life and her mother's life were tied to the whims of the wealthy, to people like the Bates family who saw them as expendable. But now, armed with the truth, they had the chance to expose everything, to bring justice to those who had been exploited for too long. It was the right thing to do, and yet, the risks were immense. They were fighting against a system that had crushed so many before them. I know the risks, Mom, Dawn said softly, meeting her mother's gaze. But we can't keep living in the shadows. We have to act. We owe it to everyone who's suffered because of them. Megan sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. I've kept this secret for so long. It feels like I'm betraying them, even though I know what they've done. But you're right, Dawn. I've lived in fear of their power for too long. It's time we stopped hiding. The resolve in Megan's voice steadied Dawn's nerves. Her mother had always been the rock in their family, but even rocks could crack under pressure. The years of silence, the constant weight of fear, had taken its toll. But now, for the first time, it felt like they had a chance to fight back. Let's take it to the authorities, Dawn said, her voice stronger now. We can't let this slide. We'll present everything they've done. We'll expose them. But as the words left her lips, Dawn felt the weight of the decision sink in. They were no longer just standing on the sidelines of their own lives, they were stepping into a war, and they weren't the only ones with something to lose. Upstairs, in his luxurious bedroom, Paul Bates was plotting his next move. The humiliation he'd suffered earlier that day, the complete loss of control in front of his friends, had left him rattled. But Paul was nothing if not determined. His entire life had been built on the idea that he was untouchable, above reproach. Now, for the first time, he was faced with something that threatened that belief. He knew what Dawn and Megan were planning. He had seen it in their eyes, the quiet determination that spoke volumes. He knew they had the ledger, and he knew what it meant. If they went public with it, his father's empire, his entire future, could come crashing down. The Bates name, which had been synonymous with power and wealth for generations, could be stained forever. But Paul wasn't about to let that happen. His mind raced with thoughts of retaliation, of ways to stop Dawn and Megan from carrying out their plan. He needed to act fast, to regain control before they could destroy everything. He picked up his phone and dialed the number of his closest friends, the ones who had stood by him when he'd needed them the most. He could count on them. They were loyal. They would help him put an end to this. He needed to gather them, to plan his next move. This was no longer just a fight for pride. It was a fight for survival. Meanwhile, Megan and Dawn spent the evening quietly discussing their plan. They didn't have much time. Dawn knew that once Paul caught wind of their intentions, he would retaliate, and likely with the full force of his father's influence behind him. There was no turning back now. The plan was set, and they had to move quickly. But as the night wore on, Dawn couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Paul's aggression earlier had been only the beginning. His family was powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. Dawn had to be ready for whatever they might throw their way. That night, as Megan prepared for bed, Dawn quietly slipped out of the house. She had a call to make. A call to someone who might be able to help them. Someone she had trusted for years. Dawn dialed the number with a steady hand. The voice on the other end picked up almost immediately, a voice that had once guided her through her training in martial arts. "Liam," she said, her voice low. "I need your help." Liam, her former trainer, had been more than just an instructor. He had been a mentor, someone who had taught her not just how to defend herself, but how to stand up for what was right. If anyone could help them now, it was him. "What's going on, Dawn?" Liam's voice crackled through the line, full of concern. "You don't usually reach out like this." "It's the Bates family," Dawn said, her voice hardening. "They've been exploiting people for years. I've got evidence, and I'm planning to take it to the authorities. But I'm going to need backup. I can't do this alone." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Liam spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "I've got your back. Whatever you need. Just tell me when." Dawn's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding through her. She hadn't known for sure if Liam would be willing to help, but she knew now that she wasn't alone. They had a chance to fight back, to expose the truth. "I'll be in touch soon," Dawn said, her voice steady. "Thank you." As the call ended, Dawn stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the decision settle over her. She had just enlisted someone who knew how to fight, someone who would help her face whatever was coming. She didn't know what Paul Bates and his family had in store for them, but she knew that they were prepared for the battle ahead. Meanwhile, Paul sat in his room, plotting with his friends. He didn't know it yet, but his efforts to protect the Bates family's secrets would only make things worse. The storm was coming, and neither side was ready for what was about to unfold. Dawn wasn't going to back down. Neither was Megan. They had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The truth was coming, and no one, not even Paul Bates, could stop it. As Dawn prepared for the confrontation ahead, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the path they had chosen. But there was no turning back now. The pieces were in motion, and the storm was gathering strength. The mansion felt colder now, its once grandiose aura no longer a source of comfort, but a constant reminder of everything Dawn had been forced to endure. She stood in the kitchen, staring out at the perfectly manicured garden, the moonlight casting long shadows over the perfectly trimmed hedges. The marble floors, the gleaming countertops, the polished silver, everything she had once thought of as luxury, now felt like a gilded cage. The walls seemed to close in around her as she thought about how far she'd come from the life she had once known, and how much more she had yet to face. Her hand rested on the edge of the counter, fingers lightly grazing the smooth surface, but her mind was miles away. The weight of the day's events still pressed on her shoulders. What had started as an impulse to stand up for herself had transformed into a fight for something bigger. The power had shifted, but Dawn knew it wasn't over yet. Paul Bates, humiliated and desperate, would retaliate. His father, a man who had spent decades building his empire on manipulation and deceit, would not let his son's defeat slide without consequences. Dawn's thoughts drifted to her training, to the countless hours spent honing her body and mind. Since she was 6, she had trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Krav Maga, first under the watchful eye of her mother, who had known that the world wouldn't give her daughter a second chance. Dawn had learned to fight not just to defend herself, but to rise above the limits set by those who sought to push her down. She had learned that strength wasn't just physical, it was mental, emotional, and most importantly, it was about knowing when to stand up and when to walk away. But tonight, there was no walking away. Her mother's voice broke through her thoughts. Megan stood at the door, leaning against the frame, her eyes filled with concern. Dawn hadn't heard her come in, but it didn't surprise her. Megan had always been like that, quiet, but ever present. She knew Dawn better than anyone. "You're thinking about the next move, aren't you?" Megan's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of years of silent suffering. "I can see it in your eyes." Dawn nodded without turning around. "I'm thinking about what's coming next, yeah." Her voice was steady, but the exhaustion in her tone betrayed her. She had spent so many years trying to stay out of the way, to remain invisible in a world that demanded submission. But now, the world had changed. Dawn had made herself seen, and she couldn't go back. Megan stepped into the room, her presence a comforting weight beside her daughter. She glanced out the window, her gaze distant, as if lost in memories of the past. "I've lived in this house for years, Dawn. Watched your father work for the Bates family, watched him grow their empire. I never thought I'd see a day when my own daughter would be the one to turn the tables." Dawn didn't respond at first. She didn't need to. Megan's words carried the unspoken history of the family, of the years spent serving a man who had built his wealth on the backs of people like them, people who worked tirelessly but were always kept in the shadows. Megan had been a part of that, a silent observer of the power games the Bates family played, but she had never been in a position to change it. Until now. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Megan asked, her voice quiet. "I was scared to death. I had no idea what kind of life we'd have. But you were so young, so bright. You didn't know yet how the world worked. I tried to protect you from it." Dawn turned to face her mother, her heart aching. "You did protect me, Mom. You taught me how to survive. You taught me how to fight when I needed to." She paused, her gaze hardening. "But I don't want to just survive anymore. I want to change things." Megan's eyes softened, a trace of pride mixing with her sadness. "I know, Dawn. And I'm proud of you. But you have to understand, the Bates family doesn't take kindly to challenges. They'll come for us. They won't let us walk away from this." Dawn clenched her fists, the familiar fire rising in her chest. "I'm not walking away, Mom. I'm going to expose them. All of them. I'm going to make sure they can't do this to anyone else." The weight of her words hung in the air. The risks were undeniable. The Bates family wasn't just powerful, they were dangerous. And Dawn had just become their target. But she had made her choice. She had seen the system from the inside, seen how it worked to keep people like her in their place. She wasn't going to let it happen anymore. As Megan nodded, her face hardening with determination, the sound of footsteps in the hallway caught their attention. The staff had begun to gather in small groups, whispering among themselves. There had been murmurs of what had happened in the kitchen, of Paul's defeat. It had become clear to them that the Bates family, for all their wealth, wasn't invincible. And many of the staff, who had silently endured the Bates family's abuse for years, were starting to side with Dawn and Megan. But with that shift came a fracture in the household. Those who had once blindly followed the Bates family's rules were now questioning everything. Some of them were quietly offering their support to Dawn, but there were still those who feared the wrath of the Bates name. Paul's friends, too, were rallying behind him, ready to strike back. The house that had once seemed so unified now felt divided, the fault lines appearing as cracks in the family's carefully constructed image. The pressure was mounting, both from the outside and from within. Dawn's actions had set something in motion, but what would come next was a question that loomed large over them. Would they have the courage to see it through? Could they withstand the storm that was coming? Later that night, as the mansion lay in quiet repose, Dawn found herself in the garage, alone. She had retreated there, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had trained for this, but she knew that this fight would be different. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her mother, for everyone who had been exploited and overlooked by the Bates family. Her fingers tightened around the straps of her gym bag as she pulled out her training gear. The weight of the world seemed to rest on her shoulders as she donned her gloves, the familiar scent of leather and sweat grounding her. She needed to train, needed to focus. In a few short hours, everything would change. The sound of punches against the heavy bag echoed in the garage as Dawn moved through her drills. The rhythm of her movements, the fluid precision of each strike, calmed her mind. Each punch was a reminder of everything she had learned, everything she had fought for. She wasn't just preparing her body, she was preparing her spirit. The confrontation ahead wasn't just physical, it was about willpower, about strength, about standing firm when everything in the world told her to back down. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, but inside the garage, the storm was already building. Dawn's determination burned brighter with each passing minute. She was ready. The Bates family had no idea what was coming for them. Somewhere in the distance, Paul Bates lay in his bed, seething with anger. His mind raced with thoughts of how to regain control, how to strike back at the girl who had humiliated him in front of his friends. He had no idea that the real fight had only just begun. Dawn's last punch landed with a satisfying thud against the heavy bag. She stood there for a moment, catching her breath, the sweat trickling down her face. She was ready. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. Tomorrow the storm would break, and Dawn McNally would be at its center. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the Bates mansion, casting a soft glow over the marble floors and gilded furniture. It seemed peaceful, serene even, as if nothing had changed. But Dawn McNally knew better. Beneath the surface of this mansion, beneath the wealth and power, lay the truth that could bring it all crashing down. Today was the day it would be exposed. Dawn stood in the kitchen, the ledger in her hands, feeling its weight. It wasn't just paper and ink. It was a weapon, a lifeline, a key to everything. Megan stood beside her, her face tight with a mixture of fear and determination. There was no turning back now. The authorities had been contacted, the evidence was in their hands, and the raid was about to begin. Dawn's mind raced as she thought about the hours leading up to this moment, the training, the preparation, the steady buildup of courage. She had lived most of her life in the shadows of the Bates family, hidden behind the walls of their mansion, kept in place by the power they wielded. But not anymore. She wasn't just a maid's daughter anymore. She was a force. And today, she would make sure that Paul Bates and his father paid for the years of exploitation. The knock on the door came at precisely the time they had agreed upon. Dawn's heart beat a little faster, but she didn't hesitate. She opened the door to find two officers standing there, their faces serious but calm. Behind them stood a small group of other officers, ready for what was about to unfold. "We're here for the raid, Ms. McNally," one of the officers said, his voice firm. "Is everything in place?" Dawn nodded. "The evidence is in the ledger. My mother and I are ready." Megan handed over the ledger to the officer, her hands trembling slightly. She had held on to this for so long, kept it buried in the hopes that things would somehow change without needing to expose the Bates family. But today, they were no longer playing by their rules. Today, justice would have its day. As the officers moved inside, the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls of the mansion, and Dawn felt the familiar weight of the space pressing down on her. The house that had once felt so oppressive, so full of cold privilege, now felt like the stage for a reckoning. It was time for the world to see the truth about Paul and his father. The raid began swiftly, and Dawn stood by, her posture straight, her eyes alert. She could feel the tension in the air, the shift that had begun the moment the officers set foot inside the house. Paul's world was crumbling around him, but it wasn't just his pride that would be shattered today. His father's empire was built on lies, and the truth had finally caught up with them. But as the officers moved through the house, Dawn's focus remained sharp. She had prepared for this moment, but there was still one piece of business left to settle. She had to deal with Paul. She didn't have to wait long. Moments later, Paul appeared in the hallway, his face pale and his eyes filled with rage. He had been watching the chaos unfold from the upstairs landing, no doubt furious that everything was coming undone. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a cold, frantic energy. He stormed toward Dawn, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes narrowed in fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Paul spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You think you can just ruin everything? You think you can just walk in here and take us down?" Dawn's body tensed, ready for the confrontation. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Paul had underestimated her, and now the tables had turned. "I'm not here to ruin anything, Paul," Dawn said, her voice calm but filled with steel. "I'm here to make sure you pay for what you've done." Paul's eyes flashed with desperation. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You think you've won? You have no idea what you're messing with. Your father's empire is built on exploitation, Paul," Dawn interrupted, her voice cutting through the tension. "And I'm going to make sure the world knows about it. You've lived in your little bubble for far too long, and it's time to pop it." But Paul wasn't listening. His desperation had turned to rage, and he took a step toward Dawn, his hand reaching out as if to grab her. He was too late. In a split second, Dawn was on him. She moved with the speed and precision of someone who had trained for years, her body a blur of controlled power. With one fluid motion, she twisted his arm, disarming him of his attempt to grab her, and pushed him back against the wall. Paul's body hit the cold marble, and he gasped, struggling to breathe. His face twisted in shock and frustration, and for the first time he seemed small, vulnerable. "You can't do this," Paul said, his voice cracking, his arrogance finally stripped away. "You don't understand. My father will—" "Your father can't save you now," Dawn cut in, her grip on him unyielding. "You're the one who decided to play this game, and now you're going to lose." As Paul struggled beneath her, his breathing shallow, the weight of his situation finally seemed to sink in. He had always believed that his wealth, his family name, would protect him, but now it was clear that none of that mattered. The truth had come for him, and he was powerless to stop it. But it wasn't just Paul who was facing the consequences. Dawn could feel the eyes of the staff on her, the quiet support that had slowly been building among the people who had worked for the Bates family for years. They had witnessed the abuse, the exploitation, the way Paul and his father treated them as though they were nothing. Now, as Paul writhed beneath Dawn's grip, the staff finally saw a chance for justice, and they weren't the only ones watching. In the distance, the sounds of the raid continued. Officers moved through the house, uncovering the evidence that would bring the Bates family to their knees. The ledger, filled with records of blackmail, unpaid wages, and years of manipulation, would ensure that the truth came out. But just as Dawn was about to release Paul, something unexpected happened. His face twisted, his eyes narrowing as he let out a low guttural sob. I can't do this anymore," he whispered, his voice breaking. "My father. He's the one behind it all. He's the one who made the deals. He's the one who ruined everything." Dawn froze, her grip still tight on him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Paul's confession, though reluctant and broken, was everything they needed. His father had been the mastermind behind the web of corruption, the man who had exploited everyone around him to build his fortune. And now, Paul had finally admitted it. "I didn't know what I was doing," Paul whispered, his eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to make him proud, but he ruined everything." The officers, hearing Paul's confession, moved in quickly, securing him and taking him away. As they did, Dawn felt a surge of relief, of victory, but it was fleeting. This was just one part of the battle, one piece of the puzzle. There was still more to be done, more to uncover. As Paul was escorted out, his head hung low in defeat, Dawn couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. She had stood up to the man who had tried to crush her and her mother, and now, for the first time, it felt like the world was finally on their side. The weight of the years of oppression, of being invisible, had lifted, if only for a moment. But as the officers secured the house and began to process the evidence, Dawn knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but the truth was out. The Bates family's empire had begun to crumble, and there was no turning back. In the quiet aftermath, Dawn looked over at her mother, who stood in the doorway, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and relief. They had done it. They had exposed the truth, and for the first time in a long time, Dawn felt the weight of the years of silence fall away. She had done what she set out to do, and now, nothing would be the same again. The mansion was quiet now. The once thriving estate that had symbolized the Bates family's untouchable wealth and power reduced to an eerie silence. Officers moved through the hallways, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the place. Paul Bates, the spoiled son who had once commanded respect with a mere glance, was gone, taken into custody along with his father's network of associates. The house that had been filled with laughter and scornful remarks now seemed hollow, its walls holding only the weight of secrets being uncovered. Dawn McNally stood in the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter, her mind still processing the events of the past few hours. The ledger, now in the hands of the authorities, had done its job. The police had uncovered the extent of the Bates family's exploitation, blackmail, and manipulation. But it wasn't just the material wealth that was crumbling, it was the foundation of an empire built on lies. And now, finally, it was falling apart. Beside her, Megan, her mother, moved silently, the tension in her shoulders betraying her calm exterior. They had been through so much together, but this moment was different. They were no longer the invisible servants in the house. They had exposed the darkness behind the Bates family's facade, and there was no going back. The authorities had already started negotiating witness protection for them. Their lives had irrevocably changed, and they knew they couldn't stay in this house, in this world, any longer. The offers of protection were the first signs of recognition for the sacrifices they'd made, for the truth they'd brought to light. But as Megan spoke with the officers, her thoughts were elsewhere. She had always kept the truth hidden, guarding her daughter from the worst of it. But now, standing in the wreckage of the Bates empire, it felt like the weight of all those years of silence had been lifted. Dawn had never fully understood the depth of her mother's pain, the quiet endurance it took to serve in a world that saw them as nothing. But now, standing together, they both knew that they were leaving behind not just the physical confines of the Bates mansion, but a life defined by oppression and subjugation. "I never thought it would come to this, Dawn," Megan said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've spent years hiding in the shadows, trying to protect you, trying to protect myself. I never thought we'd actually bring them down." Dawn looked at her mother. her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "You taught me how to fight, Mom. Not just in self-defense, but for what's right. We did this together." Megan's gaze softened, a fleeting smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you. All of it. All of it. It's because of you." The room fell into a brief silence as the reality of their success began to sink in. The household had been divided, the staff, those who had once been too afraid to speak out, now standing with Dawn and Megan. Some had quietly supported them, others had offered information, their allegiance shifting in the wake of Paul's breakdown. The power that had once belonged solely to the Bates family now rested with those they had sought to control. As the officers continued their work, Megan and Dawn stayed close to the staff, ensuring that they were safe from any retaliation. Dawn knew that Paul's friends, his supporters, would try to act quickly to counter the damage. They might rally behind his father, whose wealth had always shielded him from the consequences of his actions. But it was clear now that money couldn't protect them. Not anymore. The authorities had already begun securing the estate, arresting members of the Bates family's inner circle. But the final blow came when Paul's father, Richard Bates, was taken into custody. Dawn and Megan stood on the periphery, watching as the man who had spent decades building his empire on the suffering of others was led away in handcuffs. His face, once filled with the confidence of a man who believed himself invincible, was now a mask of defeat. He had relied on his wealth, his power, to protect him from the truth, but the ledger had exposed it all. His empire, his legacy, was now in ruins. Richard Bates, for all his money, could not shield himself from the justice that had finally caught up with him. As the officers took him away, Dawn's chest swelled with something unfamiliar: pride. She hadn't just brought Paul down. She had brought down the very foundation of their corruption. The moment felt surreal. Dawn and Megan stood in the background, watching the culmination of everything they had fought for. It wasn't just the defeat of the Bates family. It was the acknowledgement that they had survived, that they had fought back against a world that had always treated them as less than human, and that in the end, their actions had mattered. They had exposed the truth, and the truth had triumphed. As the officers left, leaving behind only the shattered remnants of the Bates estate, Dawn and Megan walked out into the yard. The air felt different now, fresher, lighter, as if the world itself was acknowledging their victory. But as they walked in silence, Dawn felt the weight of something else. It wasn't over yet. They had exposed one part of the family's corruption, but there were more layers to uncover, more secrets buried beneath the surface. Richard Bates may have been taken down, but there was still much to be revealed. As they stood by the gates of the estate, Megan turned to her daughter, her expression hardening with determination. "We've won this battle, Dawn. But the fight isn't over. There are still more people involved in what they were doing. And I know there's more we need to uncover." Dawn nodded. She could feel the shift in the air. The storm was still coming, but they had already made their mark. They had taken down the Bates family's empire, but the battle for justice was far from finished. Later that night, as Dawn sat in her room, the weight of everything they had achieved felt heavy on her shoulders. She had won, but there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of finality. The fight wasn't over. She had learned that the truth had power, but power always fought back. She wasn't naive enough to think that Paul's family would go quietly into the night. They would try to regain control, to salvage what was left of their name, their empire. And Dawn would be ready. She pulled out her phone and checked the messages she had received throughout the day. One in particular caught her attention. It was from Liam, her old martial arts trainer, the man who had been there for her through the hardest parts of her life. The message was short, cryptic. "It's bigger than you think. The Bates family's connections run deep. They're just the tip of the iceberg." Dawn's heart skipped a beat. She had known that there was more, that the Bates family was just one piece of the puzzle. But this was something bigger. The truth was more complicated than she had imagined. The family wasn't just involved in local corruption. They were part of something larger, something that stretched far beyond the walls of the mansion they had lived in for so long. As the message settled in, Dawn knew that she couldn't stop now. She had brought down the Bates family, but there were more powerful forces at play. The road ahead would be filled with obstacles. But Dawn had come too far to back down now. She had the strength, the training, and the resolve to see this through. And with her mother by her side, she knew they would face whatever came next. Together. The days following the downfall of the Bates family felt like a blur. Dawn had never imagined that such a monumental shift could happen in so little time. But as the dust settled, so too did the realization of what had been achieved. The grand estate that had once been their prison was now a silent witness to the collapse of everything it had represented. The mansion's polished marble floors, its gleaming windows, and the walls that had seemed so imposing now felt empty, devoid of the power that had once filled them. The house was quieter now, as if it had taken a breath of its own, exhaling the secrets it had held for so long. Dawn stood at the edge of the yard one last time, the soft breeze ruffling her hair as she looked at the mansion one final time. It wasn't home anymore. It never had been. The place that had bound her and her mother to a world of silent servitude was no longer their cage. Dawn had taken back control, and now it was time to walk away, to step into something new. The scholarship she had earned in martial arts was the first real step toward her future, and she was determined not to let the opportunity slip away. It wasn't just a scholarship, it was a symbol of everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for. The trainers had recognized her potential, and they had been right to do so. Dawn had spent years training not only her body, but her mind, her spirit. She had learned to protect herself, but now, she was going to take that strength and use it for something greater. She was going to forge a life beyond the walls of the Bates mansion, beyond the legacy of cruelty and exploitation. Megan stood behind her, her hand resting lightly on Dawn's shoulder. The two of them had come so far, from the quiet corners of the estate to the fierce confrontation that had turned the tide. Megan had been the one who had quietly supported Dawn, guiding her through the tough times, protecting her from the harsh realities of the world. But now, it was clear that Dawn had surpassed even her mother's expectations. Dawn was ready to leave behind the life of servitude and make something of her own. "Are you ready?" Megan asked, her voice thick with emotion. Dawn nodded without looking back. "I think I've always been ready. Just didn't know it yet." Megan smiled softly, the lines on her face softening as she looked at her daughter. She had watched Dawn grow from a quiet, reserved child into a woman who stood tall, unshaken by the weight of the world. For years, Megan had worked to protect her, to shield her from the world's cruelty, but now, she saw the strength that had always been there in Dawn. The quiet resilience. The quiet power. "I'm proud of you," Megan said quietly, her voice full of pride and love. "You've grown into something incredible." Dawn turned and met her mother's gaze, her expression calm, but something inside her shifted at her mother's words. "We did this together," she replied softly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Megan gave a small nod, her eyes misting over with unshed tears. She didn't say anything more. But the unspoken words were there, hanging between them. They had come through everything together. Every trial, every injustice. And now, they had a future. The estate behind them would fade into memory. The mansion, once a symbol of their oppression, was now just a relic of the past. But for Dawn, the victory wasn't just about taking down the Bates family. It was about reclaiming her life, taking control of her future, and walking away from a past that had tried to define her. As they made their way to the car, the sound of the engine humming to life, Dawn felt a sense of liberation she hadn't expected. The world ahead was vast, uncertain, and filled with unknowns, but it was hers now. Her journey was just beginning. But even as they drove away from the estate, Something gnawed at the back of her mind. The road to freedom had been paved with sacrifice, and Dawn knew that there were more battles ahead. The power that had been held by the Bates family didn't simply disappear. It had taken root in something larger, something more pervasive, and Dawn understood that she couldn't just walk away. Paul Bates, his arrogance stripped away, would have to face the consequences of his actions. But there was more to the story than his downfall. The corruption that had festered in his family's wealth didn't stop with him. There were other forces, other powerful individuals who had been complicit in the schemes that had kept people like Dawn and her mother under their control. But for now, Dawn focused on the road ahead. She had earned the chance to start over, to rebuild. The scholarship in martial arts was just the beginning. She had a future to shape, and she wasn't going to let anything stand in her way. Weeks later, as Dawn settled into her new life, Megan continued to reflect on the journey they had taken. She knew that their lives had changed forever, but she also knew that the journey was far from over. Dawn had brought the Bates family to their knees, but there was a larger fight to be fought. The hidden truths, the deeper connections to power, were still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And Megan couldn't help but wonder if the battle they had won was only the first of many. She thought about Paul, about his breakdown, his confession, his desperate attempt to hold on to the remnants of his former life. It had been a humbling experience for him, one that would change him forever. But there was more to Paul's downfall than just his personal failure. There were others who had helped build the Bates family's empire, and those people wouldn't go down easily. They would find a way to protect themselves, to rebuild. Megan couldn't let her guard down. She had to keep moving forward, stay one step ahead. And as Dawn stood on the precipice of a new life, she knew the same thing. She had seen enough to know that the fight for justice wasn't something that ended with a single victory. The world was full of corruption, and the battle was ongoing. But she was ready. She had found her strength, her purpose, and now she was ready to face whatever came next. One evening, after a long day of training and settling into her new routine, Dawn found an envelope waiting for her. It was postmarked from the city, from Liam, her old trainer. She opened it carefully, and inside was a single letter, a message that sent a chill down her spine. The Bates family was just one part of a much larger network. They've been involved in more than you think, Dawn. They were connected to people much higher up, people who don't get exposed so easily. But don't worry, I'm keeping an eye on things. You might want to too. Your work isn't done. Dawn's hands tightened around the letter. The road ahead wasn't as clear as she had hoped. There were still battles to fight, still shadows to uncover. But Dawn McNally was no longer the invisible servant. She had found her voice, and with it, she had found the strength to take on whatever came next. She looked out the window, the horizon stretching out before her. The world was vast, uncertain, but filled with promise. And for the first time, Dawn knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The fall of the Bates family was just the beginning. The real fight was only starting, and Dawn was ready to lead the way.